Ah, the classic HEMA purist nightmare. I hope my longsword doesn't become suicidal run at each other car antenna tag. We can't have athleticism beating technique. I'm very good at piling straw into humanoid figures and then setting it alight, but I am actually more sympathetic to this fear than I often let on. I just generally disagree. So I saw this post in one of the HEMA groups and I thought it might be worth giving my input as someone who is pretty handy with an epee or foil and who's done HEMA for a while now. So you can see here, and in a couple of the comments, that there's sentiment HEMA is becoming too much like white suit fencing, in part because the game is becoming too solved. I'm going to address this first, and then also a couple of other issues with regard to some of the most common aspects of this specific fear you'll sometimes see. Well, really one of them. No, HEMA is not halfway to becoming a solved game, and neither is epee or foil, because they can't be. As one of the comments in this thread correctly pointed out, these are athletic movement games that cannot be computationally solved like chess or tic-tac-toe. The mutability in these games is fundamentally infinite. What can happen is that the metagame of a global or local scene can become incredibly narrow in its applied scope, but that can also be broken. Foil has external resets on this that largely comes down to the top refs in the world changing their mind about what attack and prep is. But let's first talk about what a metagame actually is, and then look at epee and then rugby union. Firstly, let's understand that meta isn't an acronym, nor does it refer to simple League of Legends brain rot mathematical min-maxing. It simply means the game outside of the game, a la metaphysics, meaning the rules of nature outside of physics. The choice of knowing your opponent well and deciding to form your decisions around their tendency is part of the metagame. Everything that isn't a simple expression of basic fencing theory is part of the metagame. Advanced fencing theory often actually delves into metagame ideas. Referring to something as the meta can have some meaning, for example, in terms of describing trends in higher level play, such as the prevalence of broken time in a particular era of foil and when that changes, or when the style of play is incredibly narrow in a given sporting scene. But it's not a fixed thing, and it never will be, and in particular for epee, I think it's kind of a useless idea because the game changes too much, too often, with too much personal expression among everyone who holds one. Many fencers, especially certain HEMA cliques actually, are aware of the Swedish Olympic epee champion Johan Harmenberg. Harmenberg's big claim to fame is having changed the metagame of epee to a degree that made it indistinguishable to his character before his career. Much is made of his bouncing and fencing from further away, but this was simply him applying his general tactical principle: force the opponent into the area they hate and I love, and since these classically trained Italians and Frenchmen were looking for binds, etc. in lunge distance, this was being slightly outside that distance and punishing them for trying to bind out of tempo and space. This is a really simplified explanation, but it resulted in two changes in epee. These were that everyone took his personal tactical choices and made a lot of changes to incorporate fencing from wide with only a couple of hyper-perfective movements, and secondly, especially among less knowledgeable epee coaches, a self-parody of Harmenberg's fencing philosophy became very common, of training up one-trick ponies who specialized in creating a very limited scope of hits very consistently. But look who's the current Olympic and World epee champion. Right now, 40 years later. Koki Kano might be the most complete fencer the 21st century has currently seen. There is not a tactic he can't employ, a touch he can't make, a distance he can't fence from. He's the complete package on a technical, tactical scope. And it's because the actual professional endpoint of something like Harmenberg's ideas is, well, if I'm better than everyone at everything, no one can drag me into an unwinnable game, and being only better at most things and among the best at the rest of things still gives you enough of that advantage. An interesting similarity is actually in how possession over multiple phases in rugby union has changed. Rugby in 2015 used to have a statistic that the longer a team held the ball, the more likely they were to score. This was because attacking teams were generally consistently getting over the gain line and generating front foot ball, leading eventually to tries. After 2019, when South Africa won the World Cup by kicking every fifth phase like it's the other rugby code, you saw a change. Defences were getting better at pushing forward carries back, stopping them behind the last ruck, and the entire reality changed. It quickly became that statistically your odds of scoring grew shorter the longer you held onto the ball, because it went from a case where you were doing it to continue to smash into a retreating defence, to going 10 phases in sunken cost fallacy before booting it. In 2015, it was common wisdom that you hold the ball as long as you can. And now it's been flipped on its head in less than 10 years. And that's a game that's been played far more than any fencing will have ever been since 1900 ever. No sport can be solved. No athletic interactive activity can be solved. And that's what makes them so cool. There's a bunch of other ways in which modern fencing is seen as a poor influence in competitive HEMA, but they've mostly been done to death. There is one criticism I agree with, though, but not in the way people think. A common refrain is that HEMA rule sets can be ahistorical and encourage more modern fencing-like behaviours as a result. I completely and utterly agree with this, but completely disagree with why. Commonly when people say this thing, what they want is the most simulationist rule set feasible, one that attempts to recreate the reality of fighting in earnest by having as few rules as possible, and as few doubles resolved with a scoring difference as possible. Hit and don't get hit and the whole body is target, etc, etc. Here's the thing, that's epee. Even the natural conclusion of this line of thinking, that leads to a one-hit doubles are a double loss format, is literally an epee rule set that was still used in modern pentathlon until fairly recently. By the way, it did not produce technically incredibly well-rounded fencing, but an incredibly exaggerated one-trick pony situation. Though it's hard to say how much of that is produced by the rule set and how much is produced by the athletes having to train 5 sports because it's modern pentathlon. But the reality is, this principle that fencing competitions must be fundamentally simulationist from an absolutist hit and don't get hit perspective massively increases the value of epee-like movements and tactics, because the assumption that fencing games should be founded in that and that alone is very much a development of the epee revolution starting in the 1800s. Before that, we know for a fact that pretty much all serious historical fencing scenes had some kind of double resolution scheme, and often greater restrictions on what you can do, both in fencing as practice and even in dueling context than often what HEMA allows. Longsword had the Franco-Belgian priority rules, the Fekschul had the highest wound and other variations. For rapier, Gianni offers conventions for an assault that I don't fully understand, but definitely disallows grappling. In fact, that's repeated consistently. And by the 1700s, we have right of way, which is the foundational philosophical system for most sabre and all foil fencing from that point on. While there is some inherent simulationism to the idea of fencing, time and time again, historical fencing cultures decided that it was still important to play games that could actually be adjudicated coherently when doubles happened. And we even see such advice as in Barbasetti, where he says if the opponent fencer attacks into your beat, just finish your attack because you have way, idiots. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying scrap the simulationist perspective. The fantasy of earnest combat is certainly part of the fun, and it outright benefits me for them to keep going, for those comps to keep going, because I'm a good epeist. But if you want to see more competitions that don't look like epee, especially in longsword or sabre, you need more competitions that don't borrow their fundamental fencing philosophy from epee. We have significant changes, like weighted target, which I think emulate some of the aspects of Fekschul rules quite well, in all honesty, with far fewer brain injuries. And priority for parry riposte, but not the attack, that you see in Polish HEMA Federation sabre rules. And a bunch of other interesting games that significantly limit the impact of this post-epee paradigm. But look to your books. They detail these things. Take their competition ideas seriously, because they most certainly did. So I don't really have any videos that tie directly into this very well, so I'm just going to throw a couple at you and watch them because I want their numbers to go up, please. Thank you.